Hi, I'm Kara Mertag, Superintendent of Schools, and I'm with Dr. Lord, Assistant Superintendent of Schools. The Department of Elementary and Secondary Ed developed a new accountability system. Dr. Lord and I presented at the new accountability system at the October 9th, 2018 school committee meeting. However, it was not taped live. So today we are re-recording so families in the community can understand the new system. I will now turn it over to Dr. Lord to present the new accountability system that the DESE has developed.
Hello everybody, and thank you for taking a few moments to take a look at the new accountability system that was started back in Congress with the Every Student Succeeds Act. What you're about to see is the Massachusetts solution to that question, and hopefully we have a much better representation of our schools across the state, and specifically Peabody, and how our school system is being illustrated through this new venue. I'd like to take a few minutes to go through the PowerPoint, which you see above you here. There are a few components to this presentation. The first will be some system highlights about the new system itself. There are a different set of indicators beyond the MCAS exams, which is what you might be familiar with already. The weighting of those different indicators and how they contribute to the final projection of student performance. There's a normative component and a criterion reference component. We'll talk a little bit about those two. We'll talk about the categorization of Peabody schools. We'll go on to the Massachusetts District website, and you can see how our schools are illustrated to the public. I'll explain a couple of examples to you. We'll talk about the categorization of districts, how these things are reported out to everyone, and finally some general information and resources that will be of help for you after this presentation. So here we are looking at some of the new accountability system highlights. The first of which is there are a number of additional indicators. You might be familiar with the former system that had just MCAS scores as part of how schools were illustrated to the public. In addition to MCAS scores, we now have student attendance, we have the growth of the classes over time, whether students are engaged in advanced placement work, their graduation rate, their dropout rate, and several other indicators. And I think it develops a much better portrait of an entire school and how that gets illustrated to the public rather than just MCAS scores, because we know it's not all about just state tests. It's also about everything else that is important about a school. And I think the new indicators show that. The normative and criterion reference components are communicated in terms of percentiles. I think the best way to understand the difference between the two is to reflect back on when some of you may have participated in the SAT exams. The example I like to use is where the SATs, let's say the SATs was a 100-point exam, and the highest score at a time when those people were taking the SATs, the highest score was a 70 out of 100, and the lowest score was a 57. When they report to colleges, the highest scores are the ones that get reported as an 800. So the student that got a 70 out of 100 on that SAT score, that's the one that would get an 800 sent to the college. By the same token, the 57, that would be the 200. Now, you can think of it in terms of, let's say the lowest score on the SATs was 90, and the highest scores was 100. Even the 90, though, was pretty good. That 90, since it's the lowest example, would be the student that got the 200 sent to their colleges. So that's what norm referencing is. It's a gigantic bell curve, and it compares you in raw scores to everybody else. If there's 2,000 schools, 1,000 are above the bell curve and 1,000 are below the bell curve. That's what normative competitive reference component's all about. The criterion is the individual targets that we met. And I'm glad to say that this one here is the most important one, I feel, because it illustrates how the schools are doing with respect to all the individual criteria, the great things that they're doing, and some things where they need to work. And it's not just a purely competitive component. So they rate the students' performance for each school, and particularly on the lowest 25%. So what you'll see in the graphs that get projected out to the public, there are half of the component is the entire school, and then the other half is the lowest 25%. If you remember, you might have been reading about the MCAS scores over time in the state of Massachusetts for the last 10 years or so. There's the high-performing kids here, and then there's a lower group here, a lower-performing group that leaves us achievement gap in between the two. And what we're trying to do is to bring this lower group up. So what the new state reporting system has is that lower 25%. And that lower 25% is in any school. Even the highest performing schools have a lowest 25% of their population. And they're going to be the ones that get illustrated to the public, because you really want to get your arms around your most needy kids. There's no more levels 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like you might remember from before. It's described in terms of whether we met the targets associated with these components, so there's no more levels 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And now districts are classified as though they're one gigantic school. And every student that's involved in the school, the high school and the middle schools, the elementary schools, all of them put together, districts are treated like one school. And there's no longer a designation for a district based on one school within it. The district behaves as its own entity. So let's jump ahead, take a look at some of the accountability indicators. These are the accountability indicators that are relevant to Peabody schools. These are for our elementary and our middle schools. In our middle school. The achievement level here talks about the performance with MCAS. This is something you're already familiar with. This is what the schools used to be reported on just here, ELA, math, and science. However, the new ones that have been added are student growth. The mean of the student growth in English and the mean of the student growth in mathematics. These are groups of kids over time which have been measured in state testing settings for quite a while. So their growth over time is measured for each year. All the students that are learning how to speak English, they now have 6 years to learn how to speak English. And where they are in that time frame, if they are moving forward according to their targets about where they should be within that 6-year time frame, they've got 6 years to become proficient in English. And if they are not, then they get into one of the lower categories. And chronic absenteeism is the next component for elementary and middle schools. Those are the things that illustrate a portrait of a school to the public. The high schools are pretty much the same as the elementary and middle schools, with the exception of the graduation rate. 4-year graduation rate, the extended graduation rate, students that take more than 4 years to graduate, and the annual dropout rate are part of high schools. Also down in here, the 11th to 12th graders that are completing AP advanced coursework are also part of this component. So high schools have a little bit broader portrait when they're illustrated to the public, but those are the 5 components for a high school. So let's take a look at this new target. Again, this is the English language proficiency. Some of our schools have more than 20 ESL students, so they will be part of the report you see to the public. If they have less than 20 English language learners, then they won't be reported. But it is a new target, and it sets students on a nonlinear path to achieving English proficiency within 6 years. The targets are set based on right when the student walks in the door. They take an online assessment. Are they a level 1, 2, 3 student? And all the way up to level 6, they're trying to get 1 level per year for all the students in reading, writing, speaking, and listening. Goes by their grade they're using in Massachusetts, and all of these components contribute to the English language proficiency indicator, which again is new on the targets. So each of these accountability indicators have a different weight in the final percentage communication. For our elementary and middle schools, 60% of the final number is based on English, math, and science performance for MCAS, 20% for growth. For English language learners, it'll be 10%, and chronic absenteeism is 10%. So each of these new indicators are contributing to that final portrait, and you'll see that in a moment. We do some examples about how those percentages are improved. Some of our elementary schools have ESL students, so there'll be a 10% component to their indicator. Some of our schools do not have enough English language learners, and they'll be in this one. That's for our elementary schools. Our middle school is right here, so 10% for the ESL population. The high school, again, very similar, with the exception of 4-year graduation rate, extended engagement rate, and annual dropout rate, and the percentage of students completing their advanced coursework. Again, the percentages of each of these new indicators that contribute to the final percentage are illustrated here. 40% in terms of high school for English, for the MCAS performance, 20% for growth, 20% for the graduation rate, annual dropout rate, and extended engagement rate, 10% for English language learners, and 10% for chronic absenteeism and students that are performing advanced work. So let's take a look at that normative component. And again, the normative component is the one with a bell curve. There are, let's say, I think about 5,000 K-5 schools in Massachusetts, so about 2,500 of them are above the center of the bell curve and about 2,500 are below. And this is the normative component. They are reported in terms of 1 to 99, and I'll show you some examples in just a minute, and they're calculated by all those indicators that we just shared by school. It compares the schools administering similar statewide assessments. So again, if we have ESL students in our school, but this other school doesn't have ESL students, then we won't be compared against schools that have ESL. We're only compared with the schools that are just like ours, measuring the same indicators across the state. The way the subgroups are communicated within each of those calculations, it's the same way. For a normative component, it's, again, a competitive, where half the students are above and half the students are below. For comparisons for elementary, middle, or high schools, and this is relevant for us, we are serving a combination of grades 3 through 8. We have K through 5 elementary schools and 1 6 through 8 middle schools who will be in here. The test that is going to be illustrated is the next generation, the ones that the kids took on computers last year. And over at the high school, they're still working with the legacy exam, the old one. They're picking up the new one this year, but our high school just had the 10th graders taking ELA and math, and the 9th graders taking the science the year before. So those are how the normative components are developed for the bell curve. Okay, so the criterion reference component, again, is looking at each individual indicator within a school. And this is a sample high school. And let's look at some of the numbers here. This half right here is the 50% of the final bottom line that is calculated based on all students in the school. This 50% over here are that lowest 25%. So I'm going to jump ahead one slide to let you see this part. The points assigned for progress toward the target for each indicator. If a target was exceeded, you earn a 4. If you met the target, a 3, improved a 2, no change 1, and if the target actually went down, that's a 0. I'm going to back it up here. We can take a look at that sample. So you can see, for example, could have got a total of a 4 on the ELA assessment in this high school. This high school got a 3, which means all the students overall met the target for English Language Arts when they took it as 10th graders. They'd now be 11th graders because they took it in their 10th grade year. If you look at the lowest 25% of the population, this group only got a 2, which means they're improving, but they haven't yet met the target in this lowest population. So if we look at the math assessment, moving toward the target, got a 2. The science assessment, moving toward the target, got a 2. And if you add these up, 3, 2, and 2, you get a total of 7. Could have earned a total of 12. And again, the weight that contribution makes to this final number is 40%. This is nice news right here for this high school. Here's the growth in terms of ELA and math. This indicates that the students are having a great growth. It's exceeding the target for growth in mathematics, and they're meeting the target for growth in English, and then meeting the target for growth in mathematics. But look at over here. Even though the targets aren't being met for the lowest performing students, they're getting incredible growth here. So there's some really good things going on in this high school based on those numbers right there. We can look at the graduation rates, 3 overall, 4, 3, so they're keeping their kids in school. This is a pretty good high school based on this information. 3, their absenteeism is being met. Their advanced coursework, they're meeting that target as well. And if you take all of these numbers, multiply them by these weights over here, you'll get 70% as a representation for all of these calculations for the entire student body. Similarly, you lay that same matrix over here, in all of these calculations, it's 54% for the lowest 25%. And again, they're 50-50. You average these two out and you get to 62%. So that is the criterion reference target for this particular school. We'll look at a couple of examples in Peabody in just a minute, but that's how you interpret one of those charts. Again, there's the targets. 4 if you exceeded one of those targets, 3 if you met, 2 if you improved, 1 if there's no change, and 0 if you declined. So the criterion reference component, the idea here is they want to close that floor. That's why half of the calculation is based on the lowest 25% of the student population. When schools are building schedules and setting up programs, they really want to be thinking about those most needy kids to bring them up to the rest of the student population and close that achievement gap. So in addition to meeting targets for the school as a whole, the performance of the lowest performing students in the school will be measured as well. So every school has their lowest performers, and they're identified based on the cohort of students who were enrolled in the school for more than a year. So if kids enrolled after October 1st, they won't be included in the calculation. So they have to have been in the school for a couple of years to give the school a chance to show growth, to show some improvement with that particular student. And that's the criterion referenced component. So let's look and see how our schools were categorized. This is how Peabody was categorized. And we'll go on to the state's website and show this in a minute. None of our schools are requiring assistance, with the exception of the Burke School. And the only reason the Burke School is because of the of one subgroup didn't meet their targets, and that was the subgroup that had free and reduced lunch. That's the only target that had a challenge. So the rest of the schools are doing just fine. They're not requiring any intervention. So here is how categorization is made statewide. Approximately 85% of the schools are in this category. They're either meeting their targets, which is 75% or higher, or they're partially meeting their targets, which is between 0 and 74. For schools needing intervention, approximately 15% of the schools in the state, the only one again was the Burke, and the reason is because they have schools with low performing subgroups. There was one subgroup that didn't perform well for the Burke. The rest of this stuff, all of our kids are in the green, and our targets are in this range for each of the schools. In some cases they're above 75, but we're partially meeting or meeting targets in Peabody. So let's look at the districts. What I'd like to do is jump out and take a look at the Peabody district. I'm going to escape this for a moment. So here we are on the Massachusetts Department of Education website, and if people want to study the schools individually within Peabody, you can go up here to the Data and Accountability top tab and come down here to School and District Profiles. Here's the state of Massachusetts. You can do this for any school in the state you might have an interest in. I'm going to jump up here to Essex County, click here, and come down here into Peabody and click here. So here is every school in the city, and just click on one of those schools and you can see that chart that I showed you a moment ago. You'll be able to see live online. Let's take a look at Peabody District. Again, the district is being communicated as an entire school, all by itself, all 6,000 students. So here's the Peabody profile. We come down here to the Accountability tab. It's now highlighted in orange, and we can see what the graph looks like for the whole district of Peabody based on that chart. We're partially meeting targets. 27% of our targets are being met, and there's one school that needs intervention for this, and that's the Burke. So let's take a look at how this is represented on this chart. Okay, so here are all of the K through 8 schools, and over here is the high school. The same targets are being illustrated for each of these indicators. The MCAS achievement for the entire city is right here. You can see the performance for English, math, and science here and here for the K through 8 population, and over here, this is the performance for the high school. The growth here, which is really good to see, there's good growth here for the English and mathematics for the entire K-8 program, and over here, mathematics in particular for the high school is doing pretty well in terms of their growth. And again, these are all the students in the high school, and these are the lowest performing 25%. We've mentioned that before. These are the K-8 student populations, and these are everyone in the city in the lowest 25%. Here are the graduation rates. We have kids that are met the target in terms of their extended graduation rate, so we get our kids graduated in time. Dropout rate is improving, but hasn't met the target yet. And the biggest problem right here for the city of Peabody, you can see this right across the board, is attendance. With the exception of the high school's most needy population. The most needy population at the high school has very good attendance in school, and that's what that 4 means right there. But overall attendance is an issue for our city, and that's one of the things we're focusing on. November just passed, and we had our Attendance Awareness Month that way, and our attendance rates are coming up for this year. If we look right across the bottom, again, this is the weight of the non-high school population. This is all the students in the city. This is the lowest performing 25% of the kids in the city. Put those together, we get 32%. And down here we have the most needy kids are meeting 8% of their targets. Overall at the high school, 24%. And that's the contribution of the high school results over here, which is 30, which leads us to 27%, which is partially meeting targets. And that's how the schools are all illustrated to the public through a chart like this. You can pop this little menu down here and look below and see targets for the high needs group, for the economically disadvantaged group, for different ethnic groups in here. And you can see how each one of those groups contributed to the overall performance of the school. Some other things to look at are the detailed data for each indicator. You can click on this one or this one. You can see individual schools here, or detailed data for every one of these. And you can see all the students that contribute to each, not individual students, but groups of students that contribute to each one of those targets. So let's come back here. So we just took a look at our overall results for the city, and every individual school can be looked at in a similar way. So across the entire state, 100% of our schools, if you have 75 to 100% on any one of those targets, you're meeting, and everyone else is partially meeting. Our schools are right in here, as well as our district. So the categorization of districts, again, districts will be classified based on the performance of the district as a whole. There's no normative component to the district, so there's not a way to compare one district to another. They're way too different. But there are ways to compare similar schools to each other. So that normative component will be done for schools. But again, for districts, only the criterion reference component do we meet individual targets as a city for each of our student subgroups. The Education Board can designate an underperforming school if needed, but those categorizations for the districts are set just like that. So some mitigating factors, some things to be thinking about. First, the kids are being tested on new standards, K through 10. And we're rewriting curriculum right now to connect to those new standards. So there are some new standards that are being tested that our teachers are learning about. There's a new testing format. The kids are now taking all their tests online rather than on paper. It's a different way to test, and we're teaching kids on how to do better taking online testing. There are new curriculum resources being contributed to these new standards for those tests. This is the first year of assessment results that counted toward the new system. Things will stabilize over the next several years as kids get used to taking the test online, and we get better at educating them based on these new standards. And it's also first year using a Chromebook in many of these test settings. So some of those things to be aware of. Our next steps, we're taking a really thorough review of all of our data. We've really got some great points. We already shared a little bit about attendance and some new things that we're doing with respect to attendance. We have professional development plans in place for all of our teachers to improve their teaching and learning with their kids. We have K-12 data teams in every building that are being used to look at the data and make decisions based on how students are doing. In the elementary school, we'll be focusing on small group math instruction. The middle school is going to be focusing on English language arts. And as you might be aware, the NEASC is coming in for an accreditation visit next fall, and the high school will be focusing on the 7 standards of the NESC at that time. District-wide, attendance is our number one thing. I suggest that when our attendance goes up, all these indicators are going to go up because we're going to have the kids in school and they're going to be learning from their teachers. You'll see a district-wide strategic plan, a formal one, be established in the coming months that will hopefully link all of our schools together based on some of this data to give us a really good plan going forward on improving our school system for all. So some things, some do's and don'ts about the new accountability system. Again, the old system cannot be compared to the new one. So don't compare the accountability results, the percentages to that. The 2018 categories are not the same. However, use the results for internal planning purposes. We're going to be doing that. Review accountability resources and ask questions. This is an educational process for everyone. We're all learning how to interpret this data and how it gets represented to the public and how we can get our schools to be a better place based on this information that's available to us. I think that's it. That's it for this presentation. And thank you for taking a few moments.